We all know something is wrong. The reason we have this crisis is because since World War II, they basically borrow year after year.
You have to be skeptical. You gotta think not in terms of your portfolio. You gotta think with logic. Not because you put money into something, then you let your mind just think that way, you know?
I thought I could create a system that stores the knowledge of century to predict the future.
However, this election, it turns out in France, the euro has gone to the barricades. Nothing will ever be the same.
So it's the future is not necessarily as clear as many people might think.
Mes chers amis, avec vous, je ne cours pas pour le pouvoir, mais pour le pouvoir de redresser la France.
Mesdames, Mesdemoiselles, Messieurs, chers compatriotes,
mes chers amis, merci. Merci à vous.
Merci, merci, merci. Merci à vous tous.
Aux entreprises qui ont réuni les moyens techniques d'y pourvoir.
We all know something is wrong. The reason we have this crisis is because since World War II, they basically borrow year after year.
You have to be skeptical. You gotta think not in terms of your portfolio. You gotta think with logic.
Okay, guys. So here we go. And welcome to today's panel of the French elections. I am Ross Burland, your host, editor, and analyst at FX Street, and I'm joined today by a very experienced and reputable panel of experts in the financial markets industry. While we are literally just a few days away now from the French presidential elections, where the population of France will go to the polls and vote for either their independence from the EU or for globalism, if we were to really get down to the core of what these elections are all about, and of which I'm sure our panel today will give us a good sense of what these elections mean for global markets, and indeed for what you as a trader or investor have come here to hear and even participate along the way today, as we will be welcoming your questions via the chat link, which is made available to you in this Hangout session, and of which we will gladly take your questions when time permits and answer those. So please don't be shy, and we look forward to those. There will also be a recording of this event made available on the website fxstreet.com sometime after the live session today, and I'm sure there will be plenty of good stuff from our experts that you might want to go back and listen to again. So without further ado, let's introduce the panel and let's get the show underway. So welcome panelists, all of which of whom are familiar faces to most of our audience, I'm sure. I believe we're in the same time zones today as well. So bonjour, Martin Armstrong, and welcome back. Thanks for joining us. We met last time in this way over the Trump elections, of which you and your computer predicted the outcome against all apparent odds. So we're going to be very interested, of course, to hear what your computer says about the French elections and what each outcome could mean for the global economy ahead. And for those of you that don't already know Martin, I suggest you look up the film The Forecaster. But for a quick introduction, Martin is an economist and founder of Armstrong Economics, and is best known for his economic predictions based on the economic confidence model, which he developed. And he is known for claiming to have predicted the crash of 1987 to the very day, as well as the Nikkei's collapse in 1989 and Russia's financial collapse in 1998. And of course, more to date, with us, Trump's historic and sign of the times victory. So thank you for joining us again today, Martin. And alongside myself and Martin, we also have the familiar Joseph, who is with us at the moment. He's ex-Credit Suisse interbank currency trader and trading desk manager, and will be joined a little bit later on by Ashrad, founder of ashradlaid.com. So let's get cracking. Martin, to you first of all. Now, I introduced the scene as sort of a battle of globalization versus nationalism, and presumably we're all on the same page as that, and correct me if, or add something there if otherwise. But can I start with you, Martin, and ask us to give us an insight to what is going on in the world in respect to these elections, and what these French elections mean, not just to the French population, but also to Europe as a whole. And then later on in the discussion, I'm sure we can extend that thought to what this all entails for global markets, world politics, and the global economy as a whole.
Well, I would say that the real issue of nationalism is pretty consistent throughout history, and it's usually sparked by a decline in the economic conditions that are there, and ironically, it also tends to be with the issue of immigration. In the United States in the 1840s, after the Panic of 1837, you had an awful lot of people, gun battles actually on the streets in Philadelphia. They were against the Irish coming in, and because they were taking their jobs. That's pretty much the way it is. So it's never any particular group. It's ever, I think, discrimination becomes fair. It's whoever's the last off the boat. That's pretty much the way it's gone throughout history. So, I mean, this is fairly typical that way. And the biggest problem for Europe is really the whole structure of the EU. They're just really trying to federalize it. And that is what's causing a lot of the problems. They didn't leave it with just an economic trade union. They really came up with this idea that they thought they would eliminate the potential of another European war if there's only one government. But they really didn't quite understand that it's more than just government. You have a lot of social, distinctions there. And actually, when I was over in Europe doing interviews for the forecaster, I explained, because I mean, the EU Commission originally came to me back in 1997. And so I was there. I know exactly what they did. And I told them that, look, the euro is going to fail unless you consolidate the debts. If you consolidated all the debts, like Hamilton did, you took all the debts from the states, then thereafter they have their own debts. But then you would have something to compete against the dollar. Then you have a market where somebody can call up, okay, fine, give me 20 billion worth of euros. Here we're back to having to test the credit ratings for every individual member. And that is really kind of like, can you imagine in the States if the reserves of banks were made up of the debts of the states and Mississippi went down, then everybody would suddenly be rushing around and saying, oh, well, which bank owns the most of Mississippi, So you don't have a single federal debt. And that is why the euro has never been able to really compete against the dollar. And largely, when I was asked by the European press, well, wasn't the single currency what made the U.S. successful? And I said, no, it was a single language. And over here, you ask an American, what are you? You say, I'm maybe 30% Irish, whatever. You don't find that over in Europe. Yeah, you find the occasional, mix, but, you don't see Germans going over to Ireland to marry girls, or Italians going up to Scotland. So it's the language that keeps them separate. And so it wasn't the single currency. It was really basically that was the issue. So Europe is still in turmoil from that perspective, and they just don't get it. The politicians, when I spoke to them back then, I said, look, you have to consolidate the debt. They told me they just wanted to get the currency through first, and then they would do the debt secondly, because they didn't feel they had the popular will of the people to vote for that. They said it would look like a bailout for the Greeks or whatever. So they were supposed to do this in two phases. Of course, the first phase they put in, and they never went back to the second. So this is most of really the problems that are behind the whole French elections and nationalistic issues that are rising. You see it in Greece, you see it in Spain. I was down in Barcelona. I mean, the same issues. It's always everywhere. And I mean, even the Trump elections, this is a global trend. The politicians call it populist, but it's really basically the politicians have been doing nothing but lying to us since World War II. Every year they borrow more and more and more. They never pay anything back. So I don't know why they think that borrowing is somehow this, can go on forever. And there's just no reform.
Let's look at the French economy, and then perhaps we can then get into some of the feedback here. Joseph, let's look at the French economy, and then we can start looking at the reasons behind some of the fundamental reasons behind why some of these parties, the outsiders or the newcomers, if you like, are actually so successful at the moment. So what do you say about the economy at the moment, Joseph, in France?
Well, the problem in France, it's also the problem here in the United States, although less so, and it's not as obvious what it is. It's certainly true in most of Europe. If the euro doesn't deliver economic benefits to its populations, then it never gets a firm footing of appearance and strength. In France, the problem is basically unemployment, especially youth unemployment. If you have 15, 20% of whatever age group you're looking at, but particularly from, say, 20 to 30 or 25 to 35, that is having a real problem finding employment. If you have a structure that makes it difficult to change employees, to hire new employees, where the state interferes or at least restricts to a great degree, the ability of a firm to be flexible, then you end up with a system where the people who have jobs keep jobs, and the people who don't have jobs can't find jobs. And this is what's behind, I think, movement, the political movement. And it's not just France. It's there in Italy. It was certainly there in England. It's there in Spain, in Portugal. It was here somewhat in the United States. It's always called populism. But populism is really just a term, and usually a slightly derogatory term, for movements of people represented by politicians who are out of power. It doesn't mean that their ideas and what they're trying to accomplish or who they're trying to represent should be taken as something which is not acceptable. It tends to get criticized that way by the people in power, by the media in power. So that's not unusual. If there were not an economic basis for Marine Le Pen, for the other candidates, for Mélenchon, although I hope that pronunciation is correct, then there would be no movement. Europe has a long history of political volatility, of political choice, much more so than we have here in the United States with a much more entrenched two-party system. So what you're seeing in Europe is not something which is ahistorical. It is very much historical. And the energy comes from, as Martin said, partially from immigration, as he was talking about the United States in the 1840s with the nativist movements and the movement in the times of when the Irish were the first great wave of immigrants coming to the United States. And the nativist movement here in the United States was very much against that. And the issues were similar. But there's also the strength of economic dislocation. Whatever the cause of it is certainly increasing automation. It is also the type of globalist movement of factories and other things and jobs to other places. It doesn't really matter from the community whose jobs are gone and whose factories are gone. So the idea of populism is something which is very European. You know, the European Union is a political entity for a political cause. And its vision, based in the horrors of the first 50 years of the 20th century, is a very understandable goal for European politicians. But it belies the history of Europe. It also belies the idea that imperial systems tend not to work unless backed by some sort of force. This is an economic imperial system that they're trying to impose. It won't work unless it gathers the loyalties of the peoples and the cultures. And it can't do that if it is damaging the economic prospects of large groups of people, even if they were minorities as of the moment, throughout the European Union. So I think they really have an issue that I don't really see an answer to at the moment as to how they're going to get the euro to benefit more than Germany and, if you want to say, the old Hanseatic League countries in the north.
So essentially, it's down to people wanting a change from the status quo. And, you know, you talked about unemployment there. I mean, for instance, small businesses, I mean, they are the engine to any economy. And in France, there's more than 3 million businesses that falls into this category and are responsible for almost half of all employment in France. So when you have entrepreneurs who would usually vote conservative, Fillon in this case, I mean, they're fed up with the administration of EU law, as you touched on. That brings a lot of red tape and charges when, say, employing new staff, expanding the business and developing products, services, or even evolving into new related markets. So it's quite understandable. So shall we have a look here at the contenders? I mean, this is a 4-horse race, and we've got Macron, who's there to be favoured in the first and second rounds, but with Le Pen steaming in right in behind him. Correct. So, and then we also have a concern for markets, which, as you've said there, the far left coming through. Which to me seems absolutely ridiculous. You know, you've got Mélenchon coming through, and he wants the wealthy to pay more tax, up to 90% for top earners. He wants an even shorter working week, as if 3 hours a day for lunch isn't enough. And then he wants a lower retirement age from 62 to 60, and he wants to pull out of the international trade treaties and focus on French manufacturing. So markets are rightly very concerned about these developments when you've got the Conservatives coming in sort of joint fourth place there, as the status quo candidate with Hamon as well. So what are your takes, Martin, on this? I mean, we've got the first round of these elections coming up on Sunday. Now, many are predicting that this first round of elections are very, very key, and perhaps for financial markets even more important than the second round, because it's going to give us a much better indication of who really is likely to win.
Well, the interesting thing on Twitter was that, maybe about 6 months ago, I basically said that the Socialist Party would actually collapse and that Le Pen would actually rise above it, which is what happened. Holland basically, had to, just basically bow out. But what has happened since is basically you have the party system, where we're used to in America, a two-party system. Over there, you effectively have had all the parties kind of disintegrate. And Macron just started his party in August. And he's like basically the major contender. So it shows how volatile politics really are over there. And it's not easy for even a computer to project this sort of thing when the mood of the people constantly keeps changing like this, and you don't have a good data stream that you can put into a computer and come up with. And I'm very pessimistic on Europe as a whole, and I think that, you know, if Le Pen wins, you know, Europe ought to basically, you know, wipe its brow, because it would mean more of a soft landing for the euro. If she loses, I mean, you're basically going to have Brussels wipe their brow and say, see, the populists are done and we don't have to reform, and it's only going to get worse. So you're looking more of a hard landing, I would say, going into 2018, and loses. If she won, at least there would be, you know, maybe some back and forth. Now you have, you know, Brit exit. I think Greece will end up leaving. So, I mean, I think it would be more of a controlled decline, where as opposed to a big bang type thing that it just comes to a major head, which is maybe what we're going to see. But, I mean, the regulations in Europe are mind-boggling. I mean, I was asked to go over to a major telecommunications company. I was called on the phone. They said, look, can you come in here tomorrow for the board meeting? I said, okay, fine. I didn't know they didn't even tell me what it was about. I got there, and the board then took a vote. They appointed me advisor to their pension fund without any proposal, anything. And I'm looking at them like, you know, what's going on? Then the next vote was more than half the board resigned. And I said, what is going on here? Was I invited to like a Harry Carey meeting? And effectively, they said that the government had approved that they could lay off some workers. They had to give them a big payout of 100,000 euros to take your job. Then at the last minute, the government came back and said, oh, well, that's not fair. You can't pick and choose. You have to make that offer to everybody in the company. Let them choose. Naturally, the people that could get a job right away took the 100,000 and left. So the company was going to be left with the very people it was trying to get rid of. And I was invited to this board meeting, and the board is resigning. And I said, what is going on? And they basically said they didn't want their name associated with this company. I mean, this is the craziness that is going on over there. I mean, you have people making regulations that have no concept of what they're even doing and how an economy functions. And Brussels has just gone over the wall. I mean, it's just too much.
Joseph, what are your take on this first round of the elections?
Well, you know, I think the most. Oh, we have an echo. Let me turn down see if this works. The internet is great technology, but it is as yet imperfect. The most interesting fact, I think, for the polls that we're seeing right now is that 40% of the French electorate has told pollsters they're willing to vote for candidates who either are advocating or considering leaving the euro and the EU. Now, I don't think any European politician of 20 years ago, when they put together, or a little bit more than 20 years ago, when they put together Maastricht and the plans for the euro, which introduced in 1999. I remember I was sitting on the trading desk when the euro started trading on January 3rd, 1999. It was a seamless entry for a brand new currency. They did a very good job preparing the markets, preparing individuals for it. 20 years later, euro is fighting for its life as far as its loyalties amongst the population of Europe. I don't think anyone anticipated this. If, when you are putting together, and Martin's absolutely right, a system like this, you don't do the difficult things first, they never get done. And that's what the Europeans did. The difficult things, they've made a lot of rules about debt and debt to GDP ratios and budget deficits, none of which they enforced at the first chance unless you didn't have enough power to prevent it. The Germans and the French did not enforce it for themselves, they enforced it on other people. So I think the big problem here is that the euro has been, and the EU institutions have been unable to gather in sufficient loyalty from the people who they represent. It's the largest entity which has been successful in human history in getting the loyalties of its people is the nation state backed up by a more or less uniform culture and language. It's something that a certain sort of philosophy or political philosophy, globalist you can call it now, both derides and thinks that's not the future, that's the past. But since we are talking about politics which are at base an emotional and an identity process, when and if the euro cannot and the EU obtain the loyalty of the people that they're representing, it cannot succeed. And I don't think that the bureaucrats and the European Parliament understands this particular aspect of it. You cannot succeed in a democratic society or even a non-democratic society unless you have a beneficial loyalty of your people. Look what happened to the Soviet Union. At the end, the Soviet Union fell apart because no one was willing to defend it, because it had no loyalty after 70 years of economic failures from its people. The EU is going down the same road, and it's quite far along that road. I had hoped that, or at least I thought, that Brexit might have given the Europeans enough pause to understand that they need to reform the institutions of the Union or it's not going to succeed on the euro. I think Martin's right. If Le Pen wins, it will actually give the euro and the EU a second chance. Because will they start? It will be a shock. And what will they do? They will start to negotiate with the French government. If that doesn't happen and they maintain the course that they're on, I am rather pessimistic about this particular imperial endeavor surviving.
So you think if Le Pen wins, she will rather negotiate France's position within the EU rather than just carte blanche and come out of it altogether?
I think it will be. Yes, I do. I don't think. I mean, she has campaigned on leaving both the euro and putting the EU up for a referendum. But if she wins, there will be a very large block of French voters who are probably interested in staying. Institutionally and politically, as far as political institutions go, the pressure, much as in Britain, will be to stay, to reform. So I think there's a much better chance of, as Martin says, of the EU reforming to perform its function and to gain the loyalty of its people if Le Pen wins. Does she eventually pull France out? I don't think that is a guarantee at all, even though that is what she's campaigning on.
Is really all upon. I'm not sure if you caught me there. Did you catch that? Her big thing is immigration. Is that right? Borders, correct? So she can negotiate France back into the picture of the EU with the specifics around immigration.
Well, I think what you have to is that the whole issue of immigration was started basically by Merkel unilaterally. I mean, this was never put up where all the countries agreed. This was just simply something Merkel. The polls were very bad. Including Greece. And within a few weeks, she changed it. And she suddenly said, we're opening the floor. So that's part of the problem. Nobody else voted for that.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
but when it comes down to it, who are the ones that are most effective?
Any individual European country decide immigration policy for the rest, which is what Germany has done by permitting immigrants for laudable humanitarian make that case. But once you're inside the euro, you have the Eurozone, inside that immigration zone, you have free travel. There are no border impediments. So Merkel, for whatever reasons, and you could say perhaps it's the decline of population in Germany. They need workers, they need people. She ends up deciding immigration policy for other countries. And this doesn't work from a nationalistic and from a populist and from a cultural point of view. And I think they're realizing this now.
The thing about the immigration is this. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I might need to fact check this, but I believe there have been about 20 isolated incidences of terrorist attacks in France alone since 2015. You have the demographics of France is shocking, and you have sort of the outskirts of Paris that, let's all face it, hate the Parisians, and they're fed up with the rule from Paris, and even you are seeing scenes of fighting on the streets of Paris, mattresses on the floors of Paris, and a huge situation there in terms of demographics, where vast majorities of the schools the pupils are heavily populated by the migration effect. And when we cast our minds forward and say 20, 30 years time ahead, what is Europe going to look like? And France has taken one of the biggest blows of these policies. And I just wonder, I mean, if Le Pen comes into power, whether she will be letting down most of those who voted for her by remaining in the EU. Would she not be heavily pressured to stick to her guns and take France out of the euro and the EU?
Well, I would not say that she would stay in the. I think we'll go for a referendum. She won't back off that. But now this end. At the end of the day, the most likely fall apart looking in 28. I'm just saying that it would be perhaps soft, as opposed to if she loses, it's just going to be more of the same. That gets you your heart. It's not a crit fight. But you have to understand that I mean, politicians are simply live in their own world, and it doesn't matter. I meet with governments around the globe, and it's always the same. You have to understand a politician. If I said, okay, fine, I want to run for president, and I said, vote for me because I saved your job, you're going to say, well, how do I know I would have lost it? So a politician can't run that way. He would rather see the crisis. You lose your job, then I say, vote for me, I'll get the guy that did it.
Absolutely.
You'll never find a politician ever willing to prevent a crisis. They love crisis. And it's really beyond imagination. I mean, with the 07 crisis, I got a call from the House Banking Committee And they were asking me a question, why did Lehman fall in 24 hours? I said, because of repo. The response was, what's that? I said, what you regulate? I mean, you can't make up this stuff. People think that just because they're regulators, they have less experience than anybody I've ever met in the industry. They typically go from right there. That's it. I mean, they have, you're lucky if they can tie their shoe or walk with, chewing gum at the same time.
I mean, I certainly can't think of any crisis, of any financial crisis that was ever prevented by regulators. They almost always are reactive. The old line about generals always preparing for the last war. Well, regulators do exactly the same thing. There isn't any sense that because the financial system will always come up with more innovative ways of doing something. That's what they do. That's their incentive. That's their benefit. And they're smart people. And they're very motivated to get this done. The regulators are often lawyers who have very little experience in the industry that they're working in or that they're supposedly regulating, and so you end up with a jumble. This is the problem here, but it's much more the problem in the EU. And going back to the same idea, how is the EU going to reform itself so that it can survive? Because it's clearly failing. It's not getting the loyalty of its people. It is not providing growth. In fact, it's damaging growth in many of the essential countries of the European Union. So how are they going to do that? They're certainly not going to do it voluntarily. It can't be done without some sort of shock. And I don't see any particular shock that's available except because they're obviously not taking any lessons from Brexit, the shock of a Le Pen victory, which at the moment does not look at all plausible, or at least possible, although it could very well happen. It's certainly true that her support in Europe or in France is probably underestimated much as Donald Trump's was here for some of the same types of reasons. But without that election, how does the EU go forward? It goes forward into slow decline.
Yeah, we've got a comment coming through here from YouTube, Junior B. He says, the sad thing is, all the regulations are on purpose to slow the economy and retain control. What do we think?
I would say it's not intended to slow the economy, but it is definitely intended to maintain control.
Right.
They have never seen anything they don't think that shouldn't be controlled. I mean, that's just the way it is. And the more they can't control things, the excuse is, well, I could have if I had more power. So ultimately, any republic always becomes an oligarchy, and then it just becomes more of a dictatorship and then collapses. Historically, not one republic has ever lasted, period. I mean, if that's not a true statement, we all should be still speaking Babylonian,
Or maybe Latin, although some of us still have studied Latin. Bureaucracies produce their product are regulations. That's what they produce. Their natural tendency in every system, whether it's Roman or Babylonian or anywhere else, is to grow and produce their own self-interest, is to produce a greater area of control for their own regulations. This is just human nature. It's the nature of human organized society. And unless it is strictly controlled, and it has never been successfully strictly controlled over long periods of time, you end up with where we are now. And it's why you end up with recurring crises of these things. But the Europeans have, in addition to their bureaucratic problem, they have a serious and growing demographic problem. And modern industrial culture has never experienced declining populations. Japan is just starting on it, and I believe the Russians are as well. Although you can make some arguments about where the Russians are in that sort of idea of a modern liberal democratic system is showing not liberal democratic. So the growth rates, which are both being impeded by regulation, which is a natural function of bureaucracy, are also, although in some sort of indefinable sense, being, if not crippled, at least damaged by declining populations, declining youth percentages. It fits in with the idea that entrepreneurship and new businesses are forming at much slower rates. So this is a pending crisis for the Europeans as well. I don't quite see where they get, because it has been true in every instance in the modern world that rising economies and rising standards of living produce fewer children. But at some point, the cultural aspect of the future seems to be muting. And this is a crisis for the Europeans, which no one has dealt with really at all.
Okay, guys, so let's move on to what we might expect from the markets. So the first round of elections are on this Sunday, European Sunday. What are we expecting the outcome to be? For instance, say Le Pen were to win, she needs to win these first round elections to get momentum into the second, correct? So on the idea that Le Pen would win outrightly, what are we expecting to see in the Euro? And in terms of the second round, and then of course we have the parliamentary elections in June the 7th, I think it's June the 7th, is it? Joseph, this is to you. What are you expecting to see as a market? Let's go through the various outcomes and what we might see in the markets in terms of the Euro.
Well, I think right now, I mean, what we have factored in, of course, are, the polls. The reason we had such a wonderful bout of volatility after the American election was because no one in the polls, pretty much no one, predicted, except for Martin, and I said perhaps, predicted that Donald Trump would win. So you had a completely unexpected reaction from the markets. I don't think you're going to get that this time. If Le Pen does not make, let's put it this way, if the poll leading in the polls now are Macron and Le Pen, and if they win, you will not get if they go on to the second round, I don't think you'll get a great reaction, because that is the expected result right now. If you get Fillon and Macron, I think the euro would probably go up, since the candidate who is most anti-EU and anti-euro, Le Pen, would not make it. If you get Fillon and Le Pen, I think the result would be pretty much the same as Le Pen and Macron, Le Pen being the key element in that return. If you get Mélenchon and Le Pen, and then you have the type of unexpected result, both heavily anti-EU, one is negotiation, one says we're going to just pull out. And there I think you would get a severe hit to the euro and probably to most of the European stock markets as well. So it depends on what you get. As you're looking at it now, I don't think you're going to get a great real reaction either on the equities or on the currency side if the two frontrunners win. The key to that is Le Pen, and the key to extreme volatility is Mélenchon, if he makes it into the top two.
And Martin, have you got anything there for us? What's your computer saying, and what's the outlook from your side of things?
Well, as I said, and the computer did the Trump forecast, which was excellent, and also the Brit exit. But there we have databases. We have a long feed of results to like a market to project the forecast from. Here we've had basically a disintegration of all the various different parties, and it looks as though you have Macron, who just started something in August, is neck and neck with Le Pen. So assuming this is where we're at, and one poll I did see in France said that about up to 40% of the people were still undecided. I mean, that's a pretty huge bet. But I would agree, is if Le Pen's in there, that's fine. That is the expectation. The markets are probably still going to consolidate and waiting to the second round. Then things will get a little bit more dicey, depending upon who wins. And but I would expect that the majority of people, the response to the market will be wrong. They'll think that if Le Pen loses, oh, okay, the euro, it will survive, it's going to be okay, and you'll get a bounce in the euro, but it's just a dead cat bounce. It's not going to be something that is long-term sustainable, and that's because of the underlying economic conditions. As he's been saying, the unemployment, when you go south, unemployment of the youth reaches 60%. Even if you look at the latest consensus data in the United States, it is quite shocking. But this is all part of taxation. We have people, kids that are living with their parents into their 30s. I mean, it's at an all-time record high. You have, even in the United States, you have the issue of you can't go bankrupt on student loans. Obamacare was basically forcing the youth to pay for insurance they didn't need. We've been exploiting the younger generation, and the result is they're in their 30s living home. In Europe, it's even worse. So economically moving forward, I don't see this really being resolved. I think it all comes to a head starting in next year in 18. But as I said, if Le Pen loses, you'll get the bounce in the euro, and they'll say, oh, see, it's all over with, populism's dead. But it will not be sustainable. It would be a great short.
I agree. One of the things that the youth unemployment is at the rates that are constant and apparently acceptable in Europe. You are wasting a generation or a good portion of a generation. I mean, I have friends in Europe who I've known for 10 and 15 years now, since FX Street got started. And I remember when they were 25 and they were looking for jobs with great hope. And many of them have never found, and these are very smart, talented, multilingual people, not like myself who speaks basically English and remembers a little bit of Latin. And for years, and for many of them still now, they don't have a settled career because they can't, and not because they're not talented, and not because they're not smart, because the economy is not providing the types of jobs. It's almost immoral. You waste the abilities and the talents. If you don't have a career choice by the time you're 30, 35, it becomes increasingly difficult to achieve things. It's possible, but it's very hard. So to find this type of unemployment acceptable and the damage it does to a generation, simply because you have enough of social support systems so that you don't end up on the street, so that you don't end up in some very penurious situation, is not an acceptable answer, I think, for a modern industrial economy. And this, unexpressed as it is in much of the rhetoric, is, I think, what's fueling the French 40% willingness to vote and more. It's probably understated, for something that a generation ago they were foursquare and some of the strongest supporters of, and that's the euro. There is a movement here which, as we've all both noted, everyone here has noted, is not limited to Europe. It is a function at some point of modern industrial economy, and it hasn't been dealt with very successfully. The other issue that Europe has is that they don't assimilate immigrants very well. The United States does a much better job. The reasons are known to everyone. I have to go into them. It's our history. It's how we built this nation. But Europe has had a much different experience with that. Part of it perhaps is the proximity of everybody to everybody else. Part of it is the history. Part of it is the language and the culture. But whatever the reasons are, they have not done a good job of assimilating immigrants. And when you bring in very large groups relative to population, you end up with a great deal of problems, and they are necessarily expressed politically.
Martin, I've just got a question here coming through from Sam Daz. He wants to ask you, what is your view on sterling since the surprise election news from Theresa May?
Nothing's really changed there. I mean, other than you get the bounce again, you have people hoping that, oh, well, maybe, Britain will stay in the EU. But I mean, you'd have to get above like 135 on a monthly closing basis to say the pound is at least stabilizing. I mean, it has a lot of room. A lot of these things have a lot of air that they can move around back and forth in, and people get all excited, but it doesn't necessarily change the long-term trend. I do think that Britain leaving Europe is the only way for it to really survive longer term. And then you can see the pound, in Britain hold up. But I mean, as you know, I knew Maggie Thatcher. I mean, she was an era of where you could actually sit down and have conversations, intelligent conversations with politicians back then, 20 years ago. You can't today. You really can't. You meet with their chiefs of staff, okay, the chief of staff is at least intelligent. The rest of them, they're great on TV. That's it. There's no real depth to them. So, I just don't see the anything really expectations as far as this changing the outcome or anything of that nature. I think that it was kind of shocking in the sense that she didn't necessarily have to do it. She's trying to supposedly increase her margin, but I think it's really just putting Britain more at risk of more turmoil going into 2018.
And last question, guys, and then time to wrap up. I'll put this over to you, Joseph. We've got a question here coming in from SK Karim. Presumably this is in regards to the French elections. What are the best pairs to trade over the event?
Over the French election?
Yeah.
An interesting question. The likely pair, of course, but whatever pair is necessary to trade, and I would simply say it would be depends on the type of result you're likely to get out of the French election. Because, and I'll give you a specific, but there really isn't any particular pair that's going to go with this election, because the market is going to respond to the degree of unexpected results and not much else in the result. So if you get an unexpected result, then you want to be in the euro, and you certainly want to be short the euro. You could be long the dollar. You could certainly be long, except against the yen, because you're probably going to get some sort of reaction into the yen as some sort of safety currency. In Europe, again, this is if you get an unexpected result from the election. You would probably want to be long the Swiss franc, again, for the same reason. Not knowing how it would play out, an unexpected result would excite the safety trade into the dollar, with the exceptions of what I just mentioned. So that's the way you would want to look at it. If you end up with an expected result, which you're going to get a small, reasonable bounce in the euro, nothing serious. I don't think the long-term benefits to the euro if you're going to get a long-term run-up in the euro, I think you're going to change the economic basis of the EU, and which is behind. Of course, you're not going to change EU policy. You're not going to change ECB policy. But you will get a small reaction up, perhaps, in the euro. But that's about it. It's not a particularly currency-based, as far as a pair goes, election. It is very much one based on general market volatility and expected or unexpected reactions.
Ashraf looks as though he's joined us. I'm not sure if he's there or not. Ashraf, are you with us? If so, we'll put a couple of questions to you. If not, I think it's time to wrap up. So thank you very, very much, both Martin and Joseph and Ashraf, for coming a little bit later on there. I think that was very insightful. I hope our audience have got some good substance out of that to equip them into these elections. And you never know, we might be asking you back for the round two, Martin and Joseph, so be ready. And once again, thank you very, very much. And for the audience, we'll be making a video. This will be up in the next couple of hours on the FX Street website if you want to go back over this panel and pick out some of the best bits there for your trading plan. So once again, thank you very much. Au revoir and good luck.
Au revoir.
Thank you, Ross. Take care. Bye-bye, Martin.
Goodbye.
We all know something is wrong. The reason we have this crisis is because since World War II, they basically borrow year after year.
You have to be skeptical. You gotta think not in terms of your portfolio. You gotta think with logic. Not because you put money into something, then you let your mind just think that way, you know?
I thought I could create a system that stores the knowledge of century to predict the future.
However, this election, it turns out in France, the euro has gone to the barricades. Nothing will ever be the same.
So it's the future is not necessarily as clear as many people might think.
Mes chers amis, avec vous, je ne cours pas pour le pouvoir, mais pour le pouvoir de redresser la France.
Mesdames, Mesdemoiselles, Messieurs, chers compatriotes,
mes chers amis, merci. Merci à vous.
Merci, merci, merci. Merci à vous tous.
Aux entreprises qui ont réuni les moyens techniques d'y pourvoir.